we have a wonderful, wonderful panel that I've got the great privilege and honor to be talking with today. Let me tell you who they are. We start with Dr. Sarah Bond, Chief Product Officer and lead the product management team at Mirada Medical. She has an MA, an ME in Electrical and Information Services Sciences from Cambridge University and a DPhil in Medical Image Analysis from Oxford University. Then we have Stylianos Taxidis. You've heard from Stylianos already, Head of Data Science and Products at CDP. This is a not-for-profit charity running the global disclosure system for investors, companies and regions to manage their environmental impacts. Worth mentioning that Stylianos is a believer in augmented, not artificial intelligence, for the creation of a synergetic relationship between humans and algorithms. I'm sure that's something we will touch on in a moment. Then we have Dr. 𝗦𝗏 who's an acting director of the Institute of Security and Safety at the Brandenburg University for Applied Sciences. She holds a PhD in the interdisciplinary field of linguistics and machine learning. So there's plenty we can get into on that, especially when she lists her expertise as security culture, capability building, dietics, and cybersecurity and international relations. We need about 4 hours, I think, for this. There's so many interesting people on this. And then it doesn't stop. 𝗏𝗂𝗏 is here, an AI professor and researcher among only 17 scientists worldwide selected in 2011 by the Association for Computational Linguistics to be awarded the honor of founding a CL Fellow. He's a distinguished research scholar at UC Berkeley's International Computer Science Institute. 2019, he was named by Google as one of the 8 inaugural members of its AI Ethics Council, Advanced Technology Eternal Advisory Council. And then, of course, we met Dan earlier, leading Satalia and working with global brands, serial speaker for Google and TEDx, holding his PhD. Wow. Okay, we're in for some fun. Dan, I've got about 100 questions for you, so we'll see how we go on this to pick this apart. Some of it I'd love to get into more detail on, but I want to allow a few other voices to come through. So give me a nudge if you've got questions. You see the chat down there. Let me know if there's things you want me to steer towards. I'm in your hands here to make it the best possible experience. We've got just under 45 minutes, I believe, unless the organizing team tell me otherwise, to do this. And let's just go back to one of those fantastic examples. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to help us out with this one a bit more. We heard the example that a user has 1% battery on their phone, and Uber, like, you've seen the apps, right? You've seen WhatsApp, knows how much battery you've got. So we know this is possible, and they work out that they can put a surge in pricing. My question to you, loaded question, is if a company's talking about that at the board level, do we, don't we? What does that say about the company and their culture and their openness in the first place, that they would even be weighing up something like that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is it's not a new problem, and it's not even a problem related to AI. We're all very much aware, I think, as we've tried to book summer holidays, well, maybe not quite yet, summer holidays as they once were, that if you go on summer holiday in the school holidays, you're paying a lot more for your hotel. It's the same thing fundamentally. It's that intent of trying to make money out of that disadvantage, as it were, or that kind of restriction that you have, I guess, restriction of having children and having to go away, then the restriction of only having 1% left on your phone. So first thing is it's not a new problem. And I think it comes down to that issue, I think, that Daniel really well highlighted, that companies are thinking about their profit, yes, but also their purpose. And I think fundamentally is, there becomes choice. You can go with Uber, you can go with other apps are springing up, particularly in the US, maybe not quite in the UK yet. And people are making decisions based on purposes of companies. And I think, at some point that's going to come into the thinking of the user in how they make that decision. It's clear that Uber will do that. That kind of message certainly goes out. Companies are about making money. They're about making profit. They have to be in order to survive. That's how the world works. But we do need to have that purpose as well. And I think, it's going to come down to kind of user choice fundamentally. And I think those ethical questions are considered when users look at which companies they're purchasing from.
Sarah, just staying with you a moment longer, It is true what you said, that companies need to make a profit to survive. But at the same time, Apple is rumored to have about $200 billion stored in the bank, which on one hand you could see as an innovation blocker. So yes, that's true, but has it got out of hand, this idea of money at all costs?
Yeah, I mean, for the big companies, sure, I can certainly see that argument. And I think, yeah, it's going to come down to judgment of users fundamentally. But I think in terms of judgment of users, but also judgment of employees, I think it was one of the other interesting things that Daniel mentioned is motivating people within companies. Is that a motivation for Apple employees, the fact that they have that in the bank and they're not spending that or using that, paying their employees with that? Or is it more motivating for a person to go and use their talent, as it were, working for a company where that purpose is really genuine and good?
Sarah, thank you. Let's hold that thought, and we've got lots more to ask you about that as well. 𝗬𝗂𝗍, let me bring your voice into this conversation. Nice and early for you, so hopefully you've got a fresh head and some coffee in you to take this. So we've got this this big picture that's being described partly by Dan, that some of this is kind of natural and companies will change to a degree, but he describes almost like a revolution. But where does something like that come from? Is that consumer-led? Is it employee-led? Is it regulation-led? Or is it just going to be a million micro things that happen over the next few years, and suddenly we find that we've got a very different landscape of working and being a company?
Well, I mean, clearly things are happening as a collection of millions of micro events. There's big breakthroughs in AI that we can point to, but at the same time, there are many types of AI that are not what is sort of on the media hype cycle, and all of those things are contributing. And I think one of the things that is arising from this effect is a sudden rush to discuss the ethics of the situation. And within the community, the way ethics is used in AI ethics is actually quite broad. There are a lot of different dimensions, and the same goes for AI safety and AI security, a lot of conflicting definitions. One of the things that I think is really important to look at when it comes to AI ethics is the difference between approaches to ethics. And classically, there are three, very broadly speaking, three different types of ethics that are, on the one hand, sort of a rule-based ethics, what are called deontological ethics, and that's more like the processes that Dan was speaking about. Then there are consequentialist ethics. This focuses on the outcomes, and this is super important because, as we learned bitterly from 3 decades of failure in AI, rule-based systems always are tripping up in the messy real world. The real world isn't rule-based. And so when you start looking at rules, you immediately start getting conflicts between those rules. Isaac Asimov's great body of iRobot stories, dozens of stories, each of them basically is a story about where 2 out of his 3 rules are in conflict with each other. And that's when you only have 3 rules. If you create hundreds of rules, you are constantly in a state of paradox. And so maximizing the outcomes is something that is very important in consequentialist ethics. And finally, there's virtue ethics, which again goes back to Aristotle and Buddhism and Taoism and all, pretty much every single tradition in the world that focuses on the fact that since we no matter how hard we try, and we should, to predict the consequences, to predict the outcomes, nobody can actually manage to do that. It's not a tractable problem. And so we, in the end, still have to focus on virtue ethics, which discuss the individual character of individuals. Then locally, in a decentralized fashion, we're all trying to learn to do the right thing. As a result, the emergent behavior of the collective hopefully aims a little bit more toward the optimal, even if it isn't. And these are sort of lessons that we had to learn very, very painfully within the field of AI. I think that the ethics questions here are undergoing a similar sort of a pain. So when you hear people talking about is something ethical or not, what are they even talking about? Generally, it's a very confused, muddy, intuitive, fast brain way of thinking about whether something is ethical or not. And it's a jumble between those things. And most people aren't really aware of that, right? The thing is, casually people are thinking when they say is something ethical or not, they basically 90% of the time are saying, did that follow the rules? But that rule-based approach is actually, one, fairly recent, and two, constantly straining the limits, right? And we keep seeing cases over and over in corporate governance and many other things where the argument is we just following the rules. And of course, Facebook has been just following the rules. And so over and over, following the rules off the cliff is what we're seeing. And there's an insufficient focus on the consequences. And so, well, how do you judge which consequences are, quote, ethical? Well, that does have to go back to the values and the principles. And even the principles are constantly in conflict with each other. To take Dan's examples, like the principles of freedom are often in practice in contradiction, in conflict with the principles of not causing harm to other humans. And it's not necessarily direct. My freedom as an American and what we Americans do is causing a huge amount of harm to many other parts of the world indirectly, something that we tend to stick our heads in the sand about. And so, when we talk about ethics, there's a lot of issues already in the real world. When we talk about AI ethics, now we are adding to all those classic problems with the additional dimensions of what AI can do. And it is super important. Yeah, I do want to say something like once or twice I heard the term AI ethicist floated in our various conversations. And there is one school of thought that says only people who are ethicists are qualified to talk about AI ethics. This is, to put it bluntly, kind of insane. For a planet where people are not allowed to talk about ethics unless they're ethicists, according to some sort of philosophy canon, is disastrous, to say the least. This is ethics and AI ethics is an issue that the entire population needs to be concerned about. And it reminds me very much of our history in natural language processing, also known as computational linguistics. Because when I was a PhD student back at Berkeley in the 1980s, there was a very strong pushback from linguists, and Swan will know this as well. There was a very strong pushback against linguists claiming that those of us who were computational linguists were not linguists, and so we could not say anything about language. I think progress in natural language processing and computational linguistics, things like Google Translate, which I pioneered, and the dialogue systems that we're using in Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant and so forth, have long since proved wrong the idea that you have nothing to say about linguistics if you're coming from an AI standpoint rather than if you're coming from a classical linguist standpoint. The same holds for ethics in spades. So I'll just save my other comments for later.
Well, as you called out on me, I feel you there. The guy really inspired me to go deeper in the computational linguistics part. I think he gave some really great ideas on my PhD. So thanks again for this. I was thinking about this problem as well. I mean, I think, Daniel, in the beginning, you said you'd raise questions. Now I'm going to add more. I'm not sure if this helps, but I try to direct my questions into how can we get everything out there? How can we bring that change about? Because it's change we're looking to, right? We have a change in our societies, a change in everything we do. And AI will rapidly bring that change about. And now the question is, how can we combine that with ethics, and how can we find ways to deal with this? So there are just two open thoughts here, and I want the others to discuss on this as well and have their ideas and insights on that. So there could be either be, this is, I mean, two general ways how change can be led. One could be top down, something like a United Nations regulation. I think you just said people are based on rules, right? So rules are important. Maybe if we give them some rules, they'll be happy to follow those rules because it's the easiest for most people. I mean, discussing ethics is, the quick brain says, right, there's a rule, so that's good. Do we need rules for how to build AI from a regulation point of view? So that would be the top-down approach. Or should we do something bottom-up? Something like we are doing right now. Yeah, discuss about this, spread the word to other leaders. Maybe find some things like with fair trade bananas, right? Put a label on this. This AI, which we've been developed, has been developed along an ethics or moral code. But can I give that to myself, or do I need a certification for that? These are unfortunately more questions I add, but I'd be so curious to hear what you think about this.
So thank you so much. You raised so many wonderful points, that top down versus bottom up. The example I thought of immediately was actually automotive. And automotive is fascinating. They're going through the biggest transformation in probably 100 years, mostly because they haven't accounted for all the market forces. They haven't accounted for greenhouse gases, ultimately. And when pressure was put onto them, they just fought the legislation rather than innovating. So it's been fascinating to watch that. And now many of them are going to lose out big time because Chinese EVs and others are fully forward facing, whereas many big automotive, particularly in Europe, have got, and the US have got one foot in the past. Stylianos, I wonder if I could just get your microphone on, because there are echoes of this in other industries in terms of, one of the challenges we're talking about here isn't just AI, but it's data collection, and the data collection, storage and sale and processing is not necessarily ethical right now, particularly with the big companies. But we are seeing great change in climate and in greenhouse gases and net zero. Are we seeing echoes of that now coming into the data and technology industry that we might have seen perhaps elsewhere in diversity and inclusion, in climate and automotive, who are paying this price earlier perhaps than we are here?
What we are seeing, and I tend to agree with one point that Daniel made in his presentation, that he doesn't think that governments will alter the course of history, but corporations will. And corporations, for me, are social structures. So as money is a social structure as well, and it's something that we all agree between ourselves, and it enhances our voting power as consumers. So what we are seeing is that innovation is getting enhanced. People are noticing different things, and actually corporations are prioritizing different things than just the profit. And that doesn't come from just this decade, right? Some of the theory of constraints back in the 80s said that, is a corporate just a machine to make more money, or is it also obliged to serve the employees and shareholders, the communities and the people working inside it? So for me, we see echoes of people changing. And Daniel mentioned environmental singularity. I agree with it. If the current motivators, because the AI and the whole humanity is going after a very complex or a very simple objective function, which is to maximize our own goals. And that goals are influenced by our social environment. So for me, what we are seeing is a slight change in the new generations, in the social environment, the motivation of the people coming through that. And that comes through corporates, through innovation. I think that we will see a different type of corporate. I have the pleasure of working on a non-profit, which was something new for me, in the environmental space. And I have found people really passionate and dedicated working in this field, which as a talent, they would have a lot better financially positions in many other organizations, but they choose to do something purposeful. So I do think that we will see this in more corporate. We will see, like a good example with the United States regulations, how corporate stayed on track on climate change, on different domains that. And I believe, as a little hint, I think, like Daniel mentioned, swarming, I think that ethics, values, and everything else is subjective to a certain extent to one society. There are some global values. We'll find out of Daniel's research. Very, very interesting. But I do believe that in the end of the day, with swarming, representing all of the minorities, taking out of the bias out of societies, we can find where we stand with the values, and organization can find similar things as minor communities of people. And that's also comes, thank you, Richard, for mentioning on augmented intelligence. I hate artificial because I find it as a term antagonistic to human intelligence. We're here to make things that where the fast brain of a human might stumble, we're here to assist them. I haven't, in my personal knowledge, find one system where there wasn't a fringe case where a human was better than the system I built. And I'm very passionate about data science.
You mentioned linguistics. Thank you so much for that, Stylianos. And it is, I mean, it was just a name, right? All those years ago, just like Brexit. But Brexit's got the word exit in it. Come on, you know, you got to watch out for these. Daniel, I want to dig in a slight left turn here, but I'm responding as well to some of the questions and comments on the chat. The phrase decentralization has come up quite a few times, and that's linked a little bit to swarms that have also been mentioned. If we think just back to that comment I raised a little while ago, you know, Apple with all those billions and billions in the bank, they're not alone. Alibaba's got so much that a $2.8 billion fine didn't even touch the sides, right, with them. So we know that that challenge with regulation isn't going to succeed if it's just a fine that they don't even feel the pain on. But decentralization is very, very interesting, because right now we're seeing a revolution in finance, where countries like Philippines and Nigeria, Turkey and so on are finding that the micropayment structure and the reduced costs of digital currencies is completely revolutionizing banking, finance and money. And is that, again, is that something that we're going to see coming into all companies, all organizations? What's the power of the force of decentralization on all these arguments?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. So I have to ask myself, I'm a small 100-person company. I have to ask myself, how do I compete with a company that has infinite money? How do I compete with Apple, Google, Google DeepMind? And the answer, so how do you compete with a company that doesn't need to make money? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think the answer is you can't. So you have to change the rules of the game. So you have to change what it means to be a company. And so my guess is that for companies to be able to beat the Amazons and whatnot, you have to take more friction out of the system. And often that means opening up your innovation. So if you can't afford to hire 50 people, whether Amazon can, for example, to build out your technology, how do you tap into a talent base, a global talent base, to innovate? And so I actually think that more companies are going to be opening up their innovations, creating economic models that allow people from around the world to contribute to them, be rewarded for that contribution. And then Amazon, it doesn't make sense for Amazon to hire 50 people. They have to use this innovation. And so maybe what we'll see is the price, the cost of things going down, because we're able to remove the friction of innovation. And that's really my goal. And I don't think that companies are necessarily the right structure to have frictionless innovation. So my goal for Satalia is actually to decentralize, dissolve Satalia. That's the future I would like to create. If we could take the friction out of the production of goods, out of food, out of healthcare, nutrition, maybe we could make it free or abundant to everybody. And the challenge is, if we don't get the timing right, we'll have lots of people be removed from jobs because AI has removed friction, i.e. people. But if we could get the timing right, those people could be living a world where they don't have to worry about eating or shelter, because it's all free or very, very cheap. And I think that's the promise of decentralization.
Yeah, so interesting. Dan, just staying with you for one more moment. Are we experiencing part of the problem here potentially? There's 52 of us inclusive on this call, which is wonderful. I made free tickets available and contribution tickets available. And I always say any event I'm involved with, like, we don't mind how you get here, right? Just come and just be a part of it. Do what's best for you. It is honestly fine. But is that model seems pretty archaic. It seems like a kind of pay as you watch micropayment system could be great here, but also like things that you're saying, it makes sense surely that we could capture those in terms of the audio, in terms of the text, they could be made available. And then when researchers and companies are dipping into that, again, micropayments, right? Tiny payments are just flowing all the time as something that you did or Swan did that was useful and valuable gets rewarded. Is that anywhere what we're talking about?
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite topics at the moment. But at the moment, we get access to free software, and we're not paying for that software. But what we're doing is we're doing three things. We're giving people our data so that they can convert freemium users to premium users. We're giving them our attention, which is essentially ads, or we're giving them data that they can sell to other organizations that can either capture our attention or convert you from a freemium to a premium user. And that's unfortunately how those economics work. But could there be a future where instead of trying to grab our attention, what we could do is granularize tasks. So you could go and correct a sentence, or I could go and tag an image to get access to Netflix for a month. Rather than having to pay for it, I could be sent a task that aligns with my interests, aligns with my skills, and I'm paying through it through a decentralized work economy. Now, people might say that's a terrible future, but we could create a future where we didn't have to necessarily make money and spend money in those traditional ways.
Daniel, I really love your vision, but we need to define steps towards that vision, right? So we need to find, and that's probably you being out there in the world telling everyone about this, that this might get a few other leaders to change their minds, to try to restructure. But I'm actually just hating the idea, but it is as it is. I hired someone and she's in Albania and I can't get her to Germany. And but I'm officially kind of only half allowed to employ her. So it's the decentralized thing is great, but we need to find ways to kind of convince regulating bodies, legal bodies, everyone must get around their heads, and that's a massive big thing to do. Well, I was wondering whether you have ideas on how to get that change about.
We already have a blossoming open source community. The challenge is we're not able to pay people for their contribution. But if AI could validate somebody's code or could send it to 4 people saying, can you validate this code? You could pay those people, but you could also pay that person that's contributing to the code. If you can open source your innovation and create an economic model that feeds that community. I know there are several ifs in there, but what I'm trying to do in Satalia is create that model, create that platform that allows people to come together and build innovations.
Yeah, or maybe from the education sector, maybe 𝗕𝗓 can add something to that. What's it from the education vision? Do you think we can educate all future developers, future leaders in the direction of using ethics and AI?
Well, we're trying to do that. I've introduced the AI ethics course at the universities that I'm teaching at, and I think it's important. And we're making it, we're about to make it in the very next term, first year Common Core course across all disciplines. And again, I think this is crucial for this generation to be considering. At the same time, there are a lot of issues that are paradoxical. And we haven't even begun to touch, on the tip of the iceberg yet for time reasons. And every week I do AI ethics deep dives online where we bring up essentially another thorny conflict between one or more sets of values or principles that we don't like to look at. A lot of this sort of abstraction sounds good in principle, but when you start trying to tackle real problems and people realize, oh, there's this conflict between our notion of free market, free speech, decentralization, lack of regulation, et cetera, versus the kinds of polarization that AI-driven media is producing. And we don't like to look at that problem because it forces us to think about, sort of really hobbling one or the other of our sets of cherished principles. And until we are able to have that conversation as a society, even though AI, I fully agree with Dan, the AI has the power to tackle these problems. The issue is we can't agree on the objective functions. We can't agree on the objectives. And the reason why we as a society have trouble agreeing on the objectives is because we keep trying to look away. We keep trying to avert our eyes from those uncomfortable questions. And until we do, we can't even have a conversation about them. Once we have that conversation, then we can hopefully come to an agreement on what we think the objectives are, right? Because as long as we keep on saying, well, we want fairness and we want safety and we want et cetera, it doesn't really inform the AI how we want to balance them against each other when they are in conflict, which they are constantly in conflict.
So I did a TEDx talk a few years ago on this very subject, and I thought that we needed to agree on an objective function for humanity. And then what I thought was, well, instead of doing that, could we not give people freedom and abundance? And what happens is if you ask a philanthropist, why do you do what you do? A philanthropist doesn't need to make the world better. But if you say to people, if you didn't have to work, if you didn't have to worry about money, what would you do? The answer is, I want to make other people happy. And my hypothesis is that we don't have to necessarily prescribe that objective function, but what would happen if we enabled us to tap into the creative capacity of humanity, they would be thinking about how to make society better. So we could decentralize the objective function as opposed to saying prescribing one. And if I'm being honest, I keep flipping back and forth. I'm currently on the let's decentralize it as opposed to being prescriptive about it, but I'm happy to be convinced otherwise.
But I guess the problem, just to concretize this, because we get so abstract, is that happiness is often psychologically for most people is often heavily dependent on selfish impulses, right? And so when people sort of aggregate what they want to do, well, they're sort of and I agree that an abundance mindset helps to combat that, but ultimately there's still the way we construct society. We create scarcity. We create artificial scarcity, even as we move up Maslow's hierarchy. We even as we're getting up toward the higher levels, esteem and so forth, we create artificial scarcity around who gets the esteem. And if you look at all these movements today with cryptocurrency and so forth, and NFTs especially, it's all about creating artificial scarcity still, because we're still stuck in our old mindset of this sort of market-driven, assigning value to things based on scarcity. And so unless we get away from that, it's hard to get away from the selfish components of the happiness, which come of course, at the cost of others' happiness. And so the AI has to then make a decision ultimately still, if the AI has power at all in a decentralized, so one argument is that if you decentralize everything, the AI hasn't got very much power. Unless you have an AI controlling the decentralization, in which case the AI is the central point, cursive loop here. So if we actually, go with this scenario, there's still a winner take all phenomenon, even under decentralization. In fact, some would argue that under decentralization, you have even more of a winner take all dynamic. Unless you build in something in the system that explicitly tries to defeat the winner take all. So, sort of like there's an objective function against monopoly, right? But then once
why would you have a
society would have to agree on what is the mathematically implementable objective of how much anti-monopolist tendency you want to build into the objective function, right? And so I still don't see how to quite get away from the need for society to come to a consensus as to what we would want the AI, even in a decentralized fashion, to be driving society toward.
Guy, my apologies for bumping in there, but I just wondered, the winner takes all risk from a decentralized system, what does that arise from?
So I mean, there are many cases, so you can run simulations to show that, but just, you know, a concrete analogy would be in a perfectly market-oriented capitalist system, that's an example of a decentralized approach, right? If you have zero government or you know, very, very small government, that's a perfectly decentralized system. And we've already seen it particularly. I mean, I'm in Hong Kong right now, which is one of the most extreme examples of that. It's extremely winner take all.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Capital tends to accumulate.
Probably even today's internet, right? Not much regulations. And who's got the big data power at the moment? A few companies. So if you want another example for that, no regulation at all. That's why I always advocate working with the United Nations and trying to make regulations which are, you know, which make sense and have good ideas behind them and bright minds.
But blockchain's trying to build in regulation into the transactions, isn't it? With smart contracts, so that you don't have to have a lack of regulation or governance just because you haven't got centralized services.
Yes, but if we look at blockchain, that's another great example of winner-take-all dynamic right now. The wealth in crypto is not evenly distributed. In fact, it's accumulating to those who got the biggest jumps when they speculated correctly.
Yes, well said. So, Sarah, we haven't heard from you for a while, which is not ideal. So let's get that microphone on from you. I want to ask you about jobs. We've talked quite a few times around jobs. There's upsides and downsides about jobs, but certainly one major upside in the United States is health insurance. And we've seen so many court battles in the last few years. We mentioned Uber as one of them already, about the right for people to have sort of employment, right? That they have access to the things that we consider with a job. So is that the goal, do you think, to keep those same models, or are we holding ourselves back by being glued to this idea that we do need a job with pensions, community, hiring processes, protection, you know, allies, colleagues, the whole lot that goes with it? Have we got to let go of that idea ourselves?
Well, that's a good question. I think what jobs looks like has changed over the last a lot over the last kind of 20, 30 years for sure. I mean, we've gone in general from this idea of your, you know, job that you go into for life into you know, much more kind of fluid approach to jobs. And I think people are, certainly in my experience in the company I'm in, people are looking for different priorities when they go into jobs, particularly you know, sort of ones coming out of university at the moment. And going back to that comment on purpose and intent, a lot of people are looking for that in the roles that they go into. That's a much stronger pull than I think it was even when I was coming out of university. So having pension, insurance, etc., as a range of things that are important to you, perhaps I would say less valued by employees as much as their sort of quality of life. And going back to that comment around sort of thoughts around sort of decentralization and that being able to dip into different things and be contributing in the best possible way, I think is going to be increasingly appealing. In my experience, I work in the healthcare industry, which is the whole concept of decentralization would be very counterintuitive to that. It's a highly regulated industry, dominated by big players such as Siemens, GE, Philips. And I think, you know, sort of thinking about those companies and even the smaller ones popping up tend to kind of have similar cultures of highly regulated, kind of very much, you know, what you're going into. So I think, you know, I think it's very countercultural. So I think that transition is going to be tricky for those types of companies for sure.
We talked about getting more open innovation, more crowd ideas. What have you seen working recently in relationships between industry and academia?
Yes, I think the crowd of ideas point is very real at the moment, and I think that's been I think accelerated by grant bodies and funding bodies. And there's a number of kind of grants available from different organizations that are kind of very much promoting academia or NHS working with industry and putting together ideas, and both are effectively incentivized for working together, which is really positive. So I think certainly there's that crowdfunding of ideas going on there. I think questions then from companies are around ownership and IP, which is a different issue again, and making sure that that's really clear. And I think often the question from companies are, if I'm going to work with an external organization or an external person even, how do I know I own that, can use that, can sell that? And then in healthcare, owning that IP is also quite important in terms of, you're sort of owning the copyright, where the codes come from, so that it can be checked, audited, and so on by the regulators to show that it's actually doing the thing that you say it's going to do. So yes, in theory, I think in practice it tends to be quite complicated.
If it is,
Sarah, that's wonderful. We're approaching the end of this discussion. You've just opened up another tote of ideas and thoughts from that last sentence. That there's I mean, Dan paints a picture of an amazing future, a very different future, and this is all connected, isn't it? We talk about D&I and climate and AI ethics and decentralization and politics and power plays and countries and companies and all this stuff. I mean, of course, there are no easy answers, but there are great questions. And thank you for raising those. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Stylianos. Thank you, Swan. Thank you, Kai. And of course, thank you, Dan, for your contributions.